My name is Lucy Winkett. I'm the rector here at St James's, and so it's our privilege really to have been working with Arabella in making this come to life. I was looking through my emails, and it was actually on the Feast of St Paul, which is the 25th of January, I'm sure you all knew that already, the 25th of January this year, that Arabella and I had an exchange of emails about perhaps collaborating again on raising one of the defining issues of our time, the forced migration of people across our continent. 2 years ago, some of you may remember, we had hung a salvage boat in the Nave over Christmas in 2015. When we met, Arabella and I, we talked about the lived experience of people whose lives are simply now being wasted as they're stuck, not working, not being educated. And my own experience in the refugee camps in the West Bank and in Gaza chimed with this thought, and so Suspended was being born. What's important for us as a church in central London here is not simply to host art exhibitions. We're not an art gallery. We're a living community of people throughout the week and on a Sunday. We're open 7 days a week, all day, every day. And so we hope to raise this issue with thousands of people. What's important for us as a church is that we live with these clothes, and you'll hear more about them a bit later. We will be living with these clothes every day, all day, every service, every event, every prayer. And so the people who wore these clothes become real to us. We imagine ourselves and them as one humanity. And we open ourselves to feeling more deeply the despair and distress that these suspended lives represent. This is about those people, the children, the men and women, not unlike any of us, who have been so desperate as to get into a boat and risk their lives to get away from the violence of their homeland. Perhaps in some small way, then, this is an exercise in de-numbing us, because it's so easy to become numb to the news. There's so much of it. A final thought. I'm not sure when we were planning this that we knew that Suspended would be somehow beautiful, but it is. And the colours and the light speak to me anyway of a hope that things don't have to be as they are now, of the resilience of the human spirit and the incredible ability of people to endure the unendurable. And that is a universal story that's as much about you and me sitting here as it is about the people represented here. So thank you to Arabella for your determination to see this through. And ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome our artist, Arabella Dorman.
These clothes, as Lucy says, have all been gathered from Lesbos, from the olive groves, from the refugee camp fences, from the beaches. And when I was working in Lesbos, I saw hundreds of such items strewn across the island. And it immediately struck me that these clothes invoked a presence. They told a story of the person who wore them. And I thought that was a very interesting concept to explore the hidden presence, the seen and the unseen. As the refugee crisis is no longer dominating the headlines, it is actually getting deeper and worse. And a little like the people who wore these clothes, it's not being seen. People are stuck, they're suspended in refugee camps, in cities, across Europe, across the world. They're suspended between a past to which they cannot return and a future to which they cannot move forward. Just think about that as you look up into those clothes. Look at the individuals within the chaotic mass. Contemplate one child who wore a bib saying, "My very first Christmas." Another who reads Little Prince Charming. These are individuals, and I invite you all to imagine yourselves as refugees and to imagine your children as these children. These worn, torn, discarded clothes tell such a poignant story, and as I worked with volunteers unpacking them, it became evident that it was a very emotive process. I'd like to thank the volunteers I worked with who tirelessly, day after day and night after night, helped me with this installation. You're far too many to name individually, but you know who you are, and I could not have done it without you. And when we were up in the tower, unpacking them and sorting them out and shaping them, I think many of us were in tears. Each encounter with an item of clothing is an encounter with a human life. And it was very unsettling, it was very moving, and often strangely beautiful. For all of the fear and the trauma, however, I think of the courage that carries a refugee forward and the hope that sustains them on their journey. I've constructed this installation around a central orb. The light at the centre is reflective of that light of hope that a refugee carries with them. It also asks us to question the light within ourselves that will validate that hope. It's on a dimmer, brightening, changing density, and as it darkens into darkness, especially at night, it reminds us of the darkness in which we will leave refugees if we ignore them. So this installation is not just about despair, it is about hope. Such a small word, hope, but in which the beauty of being human resides. Of the many we helped off the boats in 2015, one was a small boy, about 5 or 6, the age of my son here today. He was hysterical, trembling, freezing, terrified. He'd lost his father, who had been put on a different boat. I wrapped him in dry clothes, and by a miracle, I reunited him with his father. And once he was calm, he dug into his little tiny child's rucksack and pulled out a little toy. He came to find me, and he presented me with this. And when I said to his father, "Why is he giving me this?" his father said, "He has carried it from his bedroom in Syria to give to the first person who would welcome him to Europe as a thank you." I turned away in impotent shame. For what were they thanking me? And this is why we're here today, so that we may be worthy of that thanks. Thank you so much.
I covered the refugee crisis when it started in a big way in Europe in 2015, and seeing these clothes here today just remind me so much of being on those beaches in the Greek islands and in Turkey, and seeing those people who were having to leave most of their stuff behind as they got onto the dinghies to cross over, not knowing if they would make it to the other side. And I was just going to read you a little bit from one of the refugees that I met, just to give a sense of what that journey is like. From a beach, we could see the island of Lesbos and Europe. The sea stretched either side as far as you could see, and it was not rough, it was quiet, flecked only by the smallest of white caps that looked as if they were dancing on the waves. The island did not look too far off, rising from the sea like a rocky land, but the grey dinghies were small and low in the water, weighed down with as many lives as the smugglers could pack in. It was the first time I had seen the sea, the first time for everything, travelling on a plane, in a train, leaving my parents, staying in a hotel, and now going on a boat. Back in Aleppo, I had barely ever left our 5th floor apartment. We had heard from those who had gone before that on a fine summer day like this with a working motor, a dinghy takes just over an hour to cross the strait. It was one of the shortest routes from Turkey to Greece, just 8 miles. The problem was that the motors were often old and cheap and strained for power, with loads of 50 or 60 people, so the trip took 3 or 4 hours. On a rainy night, when waves reached as high as 10 feet and tossed the boats like toys, sometimes they never made it at all, and journeys of hope ended in a watery grave. The beach was not sandy as I had imagined it would be, but pebbly, impossible for my wheelchair. We could see we were in the right place from a ripped cardboard box printed with the words, "Inflatable rubber dinghy, made in China, maximum capacity 15 people," as well as a trail of discarded belongings scattered along the shore like a kind of refugee flotsam and jetsam. There were toothbrushes, nappies, and biscuit wrappers, abandoned backpacks, and a slew of clothes and shoes. Jeans and t-shirts tossed out because there was no room in the boat, and smugglers make you travel as light as possible. A pair of grey high-heeled mules with fluffy black pom-poms, which seemed a crazy thing to have been brought on this journey. A child's tiny pink sandal decorated with a plastic rose. A boy's light-up trainers, and a large grey floppy bear with a missing eye that must have been hard for someone to leave behind. All this stuff had turned this beautiful place into a rubbish dump, which made me sad. Finally, around 5 p.m., they said the Coast Guards were changing guards so we could take advantage and go. I looked again at the sea. A mist was coming down, and the cry of the seagulls no longer seemed so joyful. A dark shadow lay over the rocky island. Some call that crossing Rilat al-Mul, or the route of death. It would either deliver us to Europe or swallow us up. For the first time, I felt scared. Back home, I often watched a series called Brain Games on National Geographic, which showed how feelings of fear and panic are controlled by the brain. So I began practicing breathing deeply and telling myself over and over that I was strong. I hope that brings home a little bit the fact that every one of these pieces of clothing, as Arabella said, has a story. I think it's really important to remember that nobody becomes a refugee from choice. To leave everything that you've ever worked for, all that you know and love, to make a journey into the unknown, it's something you only do if you're desperate. The refugee crisis has dropped out of the news. I'm afraid that the media is a fickle business and we seem to have moved on to other things, but the issue isn't going away. There are more than 66 million people displaced from their homes around the world. If you put all those people together, it would be a country bigger than this country. In Europe, particularly in Italy and Greece, there are around 200,000 refugees who are in limbo today, who are stranded in camps, unable to go home and unable to get to the EU. Many of them are children, and there was a new report this week by charities working in Greece saying that around 2,000 unaccompanied children in Greece, refugee children, are now sleeping on the streets because they have nowhere to go. These children are prey to traffickers, and many of them end up as prostitutes. Not only are all those people still stuck, but the world's got a new influx of refugees. I literally came back yesterday from Bangladesh, where I was visiting the Rohingya camps. And there, as you may well know, 630,000 people have arrived in just 3 months, fleeing from terrible atrocities by the Burmese military. Just about every tent you go into there has a shocking story of a woman who was raped by the military or whose husband was killed. I met a 14-year-old girl who was left looking after her 6 brothers and sisters because her parents were killed. I met a 9-year-old boy who watched his parents be hung from a tree and then shot in front of him. These stories are terrible, and these people are really traumatized, and yet they're now living in very grim conditions in camps in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is one of the most overcrowded countries on earth anyway, and so to take in this extra number of people and who came so quickly, and although aid agencies are doing as much as they can, they're really cramped together, and the latrines are all overflowing. Many of the latrines are right next to water pumps, which are then being contaminated, so there's lots of disease. But it struck me that Okay, they're in bad conditions, but Bangladesh has taken in 650,000 people in 3 months into one of the world's poorest countries. We in the European Union, an affluent place of 500 million people, could not take in 1 million people. I think I've never been as ashamed in my life as covering that crisis as a European and seeing not just the failure of governments to deal with it, but the failure to give dignity to these people. Many of these people were professionals, surgeons, lawyers, doctors, teachers, who ended up just sleeping on muddy fields in Europe because we couldn't even set up reception centres. As a journalist covering the refugee crisis, it seemed to me that I saw the best and worst of humanity. I think the best was all the volunteers, like the people of Starfish, who were receiving the refugees as they came in, the widows of Lesbos, I'll never forget, on the beaches, who were very poor themselves and yet were meeting the refugee boats, giving dry clothes to the people and warm drinks, and also love. The worst, of course, was the governments. One country after another erected barriers or tear gas or different means to stop people coming in. I think the worst of all was Hungary, which you may remember erected this massive fence all the way across to stop people coming. And the day that they finally closed that fence in September 2015, I was on the Hungarian side of the fence, and there were a lot of journalists there. And suddenly people started saying, hey, on the other side, the Serbian side, there's this girl in a wheelchair who speaks fluent English and wants to be an astronaut. That's like kind of journalistic gold. So all of us wanted to go and find this girl. And I was astonished because having covered the refugee crisis and covered the route that they go, it's a really difficult journey for able-bodied people. So the idea of a girl in a wheelchair who was being pushed just by her sister was quite astonishing to me. So I went to find her. Her name was Najeen, and she did indeed speak absolutely fluent English and had never been to school in her life because her parents couldn't afford to send her because she was disabled and they had no means to transport her. And so she and her sister did this amazing journey, and maybe their clothes are up here somewhere, who knows, because they had to leave all their spare clothes on the beach in Turkey, and then when they got to Lesbos, their clothes were wet and they changed clothes. And the day that they crossed, and so it was their crossing I was reading about, was the same day that little boy, Aylan Kurdi, the 3-year-old boy who drowned, and he, like them, was Kurdish. And so they said if they had known, he crossed in the morning, they crossed in the evening. If they only found out about it when they got to Lesbos, and they were crossing the same route. If they had known about that, they probably wouldn't have got on the boat.
Refugee blues. Say this city has 10 million souls. Some are living in mansions, some are living in holes. Yet there's no place for us, my dear. Yet there's no place for us. Once we had a country and we thought it fair. Look in the atlas and you'll find it there. We cannot go there now, my dear. We cannot go there now. In the village churchyard there grows an old yew. Every spring it blossoms anew. Old passports can't do that, my dear. Old passports can't do that. The consul banged the table and said, if you've got no passport, you're officially dead. But we are still alive, my dear. We are still alive. Went to a committee. They offered me a chair, asked me politely to return next year. But where shall we go today, my dear? But where shall we go today? Came to a public meeting. The speaker got up and said, if we let them in, They will steal our daily bread. He was talking of you and me, my dear. He was talking of you and me. Thought I heard the thunder rumbling in the sky. It was Hitler over Europe saying, they must die. We were in his mind, my dear. We were in his mind. Saw a poodle in a jacket fastened with a pin. Saw a door opened and a cat let in. But they weren't German Jews, my dear. But they weren't German Jews. Went down to the harbour and stood upon the quay. Saw the fish swimming as if they were free. Only 10 feet away, my dear. Only 10 feet away. Walked through a wood, saw the birds in the trees. They had no politicians and sang at their ease. They weren't the human race, my dear. They weren't the human race. Dreamed I saw a building with 1,000 floors, 1,000 windows and 1,000 doors. Not one of them was ours, my dear. Not one of them was ours. Stood on a great plain in the falling snow. 10,000 soldiers marched to and fro. Looking for you and me, my dear. Looking for you and me.